Hi there, this is Tim,
And this is Christine.
and today we're looking at the figure long pose drawing. So last we left off, we had seen a shadow map. Today we're going to proceed the exact same way, this is how I would recommend handling the first session of a long pose figure drawing. If not the first couple sessions, is to sort through an accurate shadow map. And as you can see, I'm starting the same way we started before. I'm trying to find the boundaries of my figure. What's a little different here is that while we have typically studied the Academy drawing being an inch from the top and an inch from the bottom of the page, here I'm presented with a situation where the pose is a little bit more square. And so if I were to go an inch from the top and an inch from the bottom, I would be cutting off the legs. And so instead I'm opting to go an inch from the left and an inch from the right of the page. And then I'm seeing where the top and bottom of the figure boundaries would be based off of those width measurements. So it's the same idea, just flip-flop to the width instead of the height. And I'm actually trying to figure this out using sight size. So I've marked my width, and as you can see, I'm trying to figure out the height by first stepping back, and then locking my body and my posture until my width measurement for sight size is correct, then flipping it and seeing what the height should be. There I go, laying my box in. You'll notice it's a toned paper, so I am starting with a charcoal pencil as opposed to willow, just like with the portrait long pose drawing. Nothing is different there.
So I'm noticing your model does have a lighter skin tone, and you're working with a relatively dark paper. Did you choose that purposely, or what made you choose that tone of paper?
Well, I wanted to try and get a tone of paper that was about the value or so of her darks, or around there, like right at the starting point of her darks, I think. So this paper, I believe, was a pretty good choice, and it's actually, the paper itself is not as dark as I might think it is. And in fact, when we're seeing this this view of it, it appears quite a bit darker than it actually might be, because we have most of the lights in the studio off. I think we've got a bank, maybe two banks on, and I'm at the back of the room. So my board and the paper isn't nearly as lit up as one might think, relative to what we can see in the wall behind us. So if I had to place this on a value scale of like 1 to 10, I would say I'm probably dealing with a paper that's actually a 6 or 7. So it's kind of just walking the line between the lights and the darks here. Now I've done some figure drawings on toned paper that's similar in value to the Strathmore paper that I've worked on before. I think we did the plaster cast drapery demonstration on. And you end up finding out that there's very little rendering you end up doing with a white chalk pencil if you start with a paper that's a little too high in value. And my goal here was actually to do a substantial amount of rendering with the white pencil and less with the charcoal pencil. So I opted for a paper that was a little bit on the darker side, just so that I could do more sculpting with that white chalk. So I've set my anchors, developed a nice basic scheme, and I'm trying to do this all in the, of course, within the first 20 minutes. We should definitely be, this being our last long drawing we do in the course here, or one of the longest drawings we do in the course here. We should be pretty set on this whole process of knowing how to make a box, anchors, and scheme in a relatively short amount of time. If it's still taking you more than 20 minutes, I would strongly encourage you to revisit some of the information in the earlier terms so that you can get substantially more comfortable with it. At this point, there's not really any room for error here. And when we get students at this point who are still struggling over this, this part of the process, it ends up just sucking so much of their working time with the model out. And if it's taking you still 3, 4, 5 sessions with the model to develop an accurate scheme, then you're just not effectively using your time with the model, and you might as well be practicing on something that's a little more simple until you develop those skill sets to start working with the model. Just adjusting my scheme lines here. You are going to see that this video has been sped up a lot more than some of the other ones. It's a little closer to the first long demonstration. We saw the plaster cast lips, in that there's some sections of this video you'll see that are sped up to about 800% when I'm just filling in a lot of the dots. And then the rest of the video is sped up to about 200%. So what we're seeing now is about twice the speed of when I'm actually working. So this amount of time you see me standing away from the easel, it seems like a long amount of time. It's actually at minimum twice that length of time. With the basic scheme, I'm jumping right into a box for the torso. Remember, there's a couple ways we can handle a figure drawing. I could take the figure as I see her and just start carving that really basic scheme down into a more complex scheme, and then once I've developed that more complex scheme, work on the shadow map. Or I can, after setting a simple scheme, jump right into the torso. Figure out the basic angles of the torso, and then from there add some limbs on. And remember, I would opt for that decision if I think there might be a little more shifting in the model. And in this case, the pose is quite a bit more dynamic than we normally have in a lot of the poses here in class. So as a result, I'm expecting a bit of shifting, possibly with the torso, because she is at a twist right now. She's not at a static pose. It's a bit of a twist. And so it's more of a struggle for her to hold this pose. And as a result, I'm opting to lay the torso in first, and then build on top of it like it's a Mr. Potato Head toy. And you'll actually see me throughout the video. Some adjustments will be made. The torso will, I think, in her right shoulder and in her stomach a little bit. Those shapes will morph and change a little bit in my drawing as things change up there. When I start to lock in the arm and the legs, because I can't add those limbs on without addressing the torso. They can't be independent of one another.
I noticed in the background that you used a softbox for your lighting conditions. What's your reason for that choice?
Well, it's a good point. Although it is a soft box, it does not have the front cover on it. So it really is a pretty strong spotlight. So we can see a really discernible cast shadow on the wall there. And that particular light has a color quality to it that's a little more similar to a natural light, which I was interested in. And I wanted a different lighting condition than our directly above lighting condition that we see often in class. And something that's so directly from the side like this is not as feasible when we're working in a classroom setting as much, just because something that's this directional like this would throw a lot of the model into shadow from some angles, which wouldn't give some people as much to work with. So we try to make it a little more more equal when we're in a group setting. But here, I'm doing a demonstration for the video, and I'm not having other people draw the model with me, so I have a little more liberty in setting up the light. And I did want it to come across a little bit more as a natural, possibly window lighting.
Yeah, I think it fits with the pose really well. Can you talk about setting her up in this particular pose, and did you go through a few different poses first before you settled on this one?
Yeah, for sure. There's usually a sort of starting idea that I have, and depending on the model, it may be more or less clear. But I am usually interested first in looking at historical examples. We sort of did that in class for our long pose. This time around, we pulled out some of the historical books and we started flipping through pages to see poses of models. And I think there was a pose similar to this I saw in one of the books that I was attracted to. And so that was kind of the basis for the pose. But then some things settle. This isn't as dynamic as some poses we might see in historical paintings. but it's something that's a little more reasonable for the model to hold. And I knew I wanted some contrasting angles here, so we've got a leg outstretched, and then we have the leg bent to kind of oppose it. So I am thinking quite a bit about my compositional stem here, which is basically a diagonal stem with some subtle opposing angles, like we talked about in our lecture course, first term. So it's pretty simple, and then it's kind of this idea that the more twisting and foreshortening we have in a pose, like we talked about with Rockwell, the more dynamic it can end up being. And so I'm trying to introduce a little bit of a twist here, but it's kind of dancing that line between what's reasonable versus what's too difficult for the model to hold. And you do need to have, well, it's good to have some idea of the capabilities of your model, because some models will be able to hold things that are a little bit more dynamic. And some models think they can hold things a little more dynamic, and they really have a hard time with it. And they don't quite yet know their limits. So if you've worked with a model a few times, you begin to get a feel for their capabilities, which can allow you to do more interesting and different dynamic things. In class, when we test out new models and we don't know their capabilities, usually it's a simple pose, like they're sitting on a stool, they have maybe one leg up on a box or something like that, so we have a little bit of opposition to the long or the standard sitting pose. And then we have a light from above, and then we see how well the model holds. Some models do really well, some don't do too well at all. And then we can take it from there. The pose that her head is in, although we have that for the picture-in-picture, her head wasn't necessarily in that pose the whole time. Now, it's easier for her to hold her body in that position because she has her arms to support her. Her head was only in that position when I needed to take the measurements for the head, and then when I actually drew her face. Other than that, her head was free to move around a little bit. It would just be too challenging to hold that pose for a 7-session pose with her head in that position. So I'm just whittling away this torso box here. You notice I did put some anchors on the torso box, and I actually, you may have seen me earlier, I plotted using my anchors a point that connected her right shoulder and her neck up there, and then I used that to launch 2 scheme lines off of, which is an effective way to throw 2 scheme lines down with 1 measurement. And here I'm just sort of sorting out the whole topography going down the front side of the model. You'll notice the back side of the model is relatively straight, and then it's sort of obscured by the arm. Some students get confused about what to do in that situation. And in this case, I've opted for simplification. I kept the back side pretty straight. I didn't even bother messing with where the arm is in front of the torso there. I just left the original scheme line, and I'll build it up from there. Eventually, I'll introduce some of those smaller shapes, but there's just not enough information for the back side of that torso box for me to really do anything with at this stage. The cuts, if I were to get the glutes to the back there, it's just the angles are just too subtle to even deal with at this point. So I'm not even going to address it quite yet, at least until I get a little bit more information on here. So you see I started to block in where the knees are going to be. I started to block in an angle for the shoulder. I'm starting to develop a little bit more. And the more I develop, the more confident I'll be with being able to place some of those smaller angles. And there I go. But you'll notice that I end up spending quite a bit more time in this one area here. I'm plotting a point right now to where I think it's going to be. And then I measure it and lay it down here, and then I end up going back and remeasuring and remeasuring and remeasuring. I end up spending quite a bit of time just on this one little area because it's so subtle. And that's one of the things that I notice that's a little different from my working method as opposed to some of the students' working method, is that if they see something that's subtle like that, I think some students have the idea that they just have to throw something in there that's kind of close and it'll be representative of it, as opposed to a big angle, which they think they have to measure more accurately. But the subtle angles can be the most tricky because if they're off even by a tiny bit, then it really ruins the credibility of the drawing. So you have to actually slow down a lot and spend a lot more time whenever you notice a smaller angle change. And so that's going to be true with the like the arm. There's a lot of tiny angle changes there in the arm.
The hamstring.
Yep,
And
absolutely.
obviously, you don't see it in this particular piece, but that's one spot that I've noticed. The back of the knee, where your calf is meeting your hamstring, is a spot too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there's just so many little subtle angles all over the body, and we have to understand that they can't all be left as simple scheme lines. And I see students do that quite a bit. If they notice an angle is pretty simple, they'll kind of leave it as the basic angle and then move on. And it's fine if you come back and eventually address it, but a lot of students, I think, tend to have this idea of, well, it's kind of subtle and my line is close enough, so that's good enough. And it's really not. It just demands a higher level of sensitivity and a greater attention to actually hitting those angles precisely. Notice that big scheme line there. I had plotted to that point where both of the legs meet, and I launched an angle going across what actually is the top of her right leg, kind of ignoring the whole bottom of the leg. And that's what an initial scheme line should be, a big, big line. I'm not necessarily trying to connect tiny little segments. Now I'll start to break up that big line into smaller segments, but only after I've figured out what the big angle should be.
Do you think that if you really hit those subtle turns like you were talking about, and those subtle angles, that's going to help you to have another place to measure off of, another place to measure your angles off of? I mean, I could see myself doing that.
Well, yes and no. If you do it well, if it's accurate, then yes. But if you fall into the habit of measuring off of especially smaller units, smaller measurements that you've placed too much, then it can come into this like copy of a copy of a copy of a copy thing. Because if it's a millimeter off, then the next measurement you make might be 2 millimeters off, and the next measurement you make might be 3 millimeters off, et cetera. And so that could snowball. So it does give you another thing to measure off of, as long as you're still measuring off of your anchors and your box. And I think that's the key there. And sometimes we forget that it just can't be one that you're measuring off of, but it has to be the anchors, it has to be the box, and it has to fit into the little marks that you've made. And if any one of those is not fitting for some reason, then you have to pause and start to backtrack and figure out where it went wrong. Hopefully at this point in the game, it's not the box and anchors, because we've spent basically 2 entire terms, 2.5 terms almost, by starting with that process. So if you're not able to hit an accurate box and anchors at this point, then you really shouldn't be doing this part of the drawing. But you're right, as you're getting into these smaller and more subtle angles, you should be able to measure off of them, and they should match other angles and measurements, as well as your box and anchors. So it's kind of nice, because then if you take a new measurement like this calf muscle, for example, that I'm making a line for, if I do that line and I base it off of my box and my anchors, and it's correct off of those, and then I say measure that scheme line to the kneecap, and it's not correct, well, then it's a pretty good chance that it might be the kneecap that's wrong. And so I'll go back and check the kneecap off of my box and anchors. Because if one of them is correct off the box and the anchors, and it's not correct off of the other measurement, then it's an indication that the other measurement is wrong. So it's this really complex web of measurements that we're building here, but they all have to lock into place. They all have to agree with each other. And then, just to be devil's advocate on that same token, this is a model which is slightly moving, so we have to be careful, because we can't just randomly measure necessarily independent parts. So, measuring the hand and comparing it to the foot might be good in one sitting, but it won't be good in the next sitting. And so we have to, measure locally and then compare that local to our box and our anchors. And the other thing to do also that you have to do if you want to be able to successfully use your box and anchors as units of measurement or checks for measurement is each sitting getting the model back into pose, which is something that I notice students and people in Open Studio sort of skip when the model gets back up there. You know, the model is changing every 20 minutes and taking a break and then coming back. And if you don't spend that first couple minutes making sure that the model's pose is correct, that her body is touching all of the anchors and that the box is still proportionally correct and all that sort of stuff, if you don't do all those checks, then you can't measure off of your box and anchors because they're completely different. It's not something that you should rush through. And what happens is a lot of students will get halfway through the sitting, like 10 or 15 minutes through.
Wait a second.
Yeah, wait a second, and then realize that, oh, you've moved. Can you move back? And well, you've just based 15 minutes of measurements off of something that's different, and it's caused you to put a lot of incorrect information on the drawing. And then it results in a lot more backtracking. And then other students get upset because they don't think it was different, and it can become a huge hassle.
Yeah, I think a lot of students don't want to say anything coming back from a break because they don't want to offend the model. And truly, I don't see that as being a real issue. You know, I mean, they can't see themselves. So
right, yeah, you're absolutely right.
I think they would rather you just direct them. Yeah, so you guys make it a successful drawing.
Yeah, I think most models are willing and wanting to be corrected into the pose if something's a little bit off. Now, what you want to avoid is what some students do, or some people in Open Studio do, is some of the like under your breath comments, like, "Well, she was completely different before," kind of thing.
Come on.
And you know that can make the model feel uncomfortable because if you didn't tell the model to shift into the correct pose, how are they going to know?
Well, and also if you're communicating to the model to shift their head a certain way back to where it needs to be, etc., they might be able to pick up on certain things that they tend to do. Maybe they always sit back into a certain angle or whatever, and they can self-correct, and they might have more self-awareness, and it'll help them in the future. So,
absolutely,
and you in the future.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Yeah, it's you really do have to have good communication with the model. And you know, models are doing this because they enjoy doing it, and they want to be a part of you know, art in general. And if everybody gets grumpy and nobody comes out with a good drawing, then it doesn't end up helping anybody. And we have to get past that immature sort of attitude of blaming the model for why our drawings aren't working out. We have to start to take accountability, and that's probably one of the most important things too. And that was one of the first things I learned when I took a figure drawing class. First thing the teacher said was, "You're not allowed to blame the model for moving because you know, they're people.
Mm-hmm.
They move."
It's part of the challenge.
Yeah.
Of a figure drawing.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. But again, I think it's something that we've talked about before. It's in those subtle movements, you can sometimes pick and select some of the more beautiful arrangements of muscles or twists or turns or features, even if they're slight by millimeters. Something can turn from looking awkward to looking very beautiful. And if we're always working from a static, non-moving figure, then we would miss a lot of that information. I'm getting into my shadow map now. So I'm actually about an hour into this drawing before starting the shadow map. But I wanted to be pretty certain that my envelope was correct before proceeding too far. At this stage, I'm working on a paper that, once again, I haven't had a huge amount of familiarity with. I think I've done one other drawing on this toning of paper, and it was probably 8 months ago. And so the shadow mapping that I'm doing is what I think is going to be where the white chalk versus the charcoal is going to be placed, which pretty much corresponds to the lights and darks when I squint down at the model. So I'm going to end up putting her chest above her breast, mostly in the dark, that cast shadow, and part of the form shadow of the arm in the dark as well. And again, as we get into areas where there's smaller cuts to be made, smaller measurements, you'll notice I start to take even more time to try and get those right.
Is this time frame about right for a student as well? Should they, at this point, be able to get this far in an hour?
More or less, yeah. I think that's a reasonable ambition. I mean, we should be able to get through at least a basic shadow map of what we'll see by the end of this sitting here within a 3-hour session. That's certainly reasonable. And that is with a pretty high level of precision, too. I actually have a lot of students who will come in from Open Studio, and they'll have a lot more done than what I'm about to have done here. But it's immediately apparent that a lot of the proportions end up being wrong. One of the most common is that the head ends up being too small, and wrists and arms get pinched, and hands get too big. Just because as they start to get to some of these smaller units, they're not taking as much care, and they're just trying to fly through the drawing. But we really have to slow down and make sure everything's extra precise, as well as making sure our lines are nice and precise and fine. You know, we've talked about this before. A thick line can skew your measurements and make incorrect shapes on your drawing. So if you start to get into some smaller shapes, you either need to be taking out the charcoal pencil or be going, slow enough with the willow so that those lines are pretty sharp and precise and fine. This shadow mapping that's happening in here in the figure is a bit different than what we might see in something like a bark plate because it's kind of random and kind of complex. There's no real solid shadow shape really for me to box. It's kind of an all-over super complex puzzle piece shape that I'm trying to sort through. So as a result, every once in a while I'm measuring to, like this, measuring to certain points here just to make sure that the scheme lines that I'm adding have a good place to launch off of or are going to a place that's intended and not cutting through too much of the overall envelope. And at this point, it's just a lot of measuring off of anchors, and every once in a while measuring off of something in the envelope. I'm not quite to the point yet, I think, where I'm confident measuring off of the smaller marks I've made within this shadow map yet. I don't think the shadow map is strong enough yet for me to start basing decisions off of other shadow map lines, but I can base decisions off of my envelope lines a little bit. And you definitely want to be doing that. As you're developing a shadow map, you have to remember that it's not independent of the envelope. It has to fit into the envelope accurately, or else you end up shifting around pieces of anatomy later on. Then, of course, as this shadow map gets developed a little bit more, the envelope can end up getting a little more resolved as well. If you were going to opt for a more finished figure envelope than what we're going to see here, then you may end up wanting to spend the whole first day on it as opposed to the first day on the envelope and shadow map. I'm kind of doing here a little bit of what we saw with the portrait demonstration, where I'm resolving the shadow map to a point where it's good enough for me to begin adding values with the intent to resolve and refine some of the shapes as I'm refining the values. So again, that's something that may be a little uncomfortable for students to do because it's going to force you to handle, at least to a small degree, shape, value, and edge simultaneously. But it's up to you ultimately. If you want to have a more resolved envelope, more resolved shadow map before starting your shading, or if you want something that's accurate but a little more basic.
At this point, when you're walking around the classroom, what are you kind of noticing consistently as far as mistakes students are making at this stage of the game?
That's a good question. Well, to be honest, a lot of students are still having a bit of confusion over something as basic as what boundaries they should be using for their torso box. That's something that comes up commonly. To which I think the best response is whichever boundaries you can see most clearly without cutting through the torso. Because what ends up happening, I've had some students randomly or it seems arbitrarily cut through the torso and make the top of their box where the armpit's at. And they completely exclude the shoulders and trapezius. And then as they start to develop this shadow map, they get really confused because they thought they had included the whole torso box. So we have to remember that it's about being clear and not forgetting what you had set as markers. And some students do get really confused as some of these marks start to develop, especially because they're developing so slowly. And the slower it develops, the more risk there is for us to forget where we were kind of going with some of the drawing. And so I'll walk around and some students will have notes with arrows pointing to where all these points and lines are supposed to be on the model. And that can be kind of dangerous. I would encourage instead to start to resolve specific shapes so that when you squint down at the drawing, you can see what shape on the model you were drawing just by squinting at the model. You can kind of reconcile those two. The other important thing to help clarify things, which I highly recommend, is to do a note hand in the beginning. Even if it's only spending a few minutes on it just to get the overall shadow shape pattern on a separate sheet of paper, just so you can understand the shapes that you're trying to measure and sort through. And I can usually get students to do that, but it's rare that a student will ever keep that out during the course of their shadow mapping, which is odd to me because that's something that I would put on my board or have next to me down on the floor near the easel so that I can constantly refer back to it so that I don't get lost through all these measurements. Because essentially, all we're doing here with the shadow map is creating a note hand. That's all it is just a note hand we're trying to measure and draw out. So it should have the same qualities as a note hand. But as we go slower and we're making smaller, more precise measurements, there's just this greater risk that we can get lost and confused and lose track to what we were doing before.
Well, I think at this point, I know for me when we first started boxing in the torso and working in that way, I was thinking too much about anatomy at this point in the drawing, and that's what confused me. And I was kind of wondering, okay, well, what fits in the torso? And I was thinking about the different anatomy drawings that we were doing, and I think that was the problem. Instead, you came over and you're pretty direct in saying it's whatever's the clearest for you, and whatever you're going to remember, whatever point it might be. For you to be communicating properly with yourself. Don't think about anatomy at this point.
Right.
And and you're not at this point of the drawing.
Yeah, it should absolutely still be an abstract drawing at this point. And it's just so hard for students to believe. I still to this day have trouble convincing students that they're just drawing an abstract pattern of light and dark, and that we're going to add the anatomy on top of it later. I think there's just this sort of comfort for them thinking, well, if I can just figure out the anatomy pieces and where they go in this torso or figure, then I'll be able to get all my measurements correctly. Where it's usually the reverse is true. Is if you can just figure out that pattern of light and dark, you'll have a superb guideline to place all of your anatomy, and you'll run a much greater chance of having everything be more accurate. But it's a bit of a mind game, both figurative and portrait. For whatever reason, when we're dealing with barred plates and we're dealing with still life, I can convince people to think abstractly. But as soon as we get to figure and portrait, there's this sort of petrifying fear that if we don't know the anatomy, if we're not describing the planes of the form yet, then it's not going to turn out right. And it's just very difficult for students to let go of.
Yeah, I had someone come up to me in Open Studio and say, I get what you're doing. And I'm like, you do? And she said, the planes, you're using the planes. And I'm like, no, I'm not, because it was in a really early stage of the drawing, and it honestly wasn't anything I was thinking of. I'm like, maybe it's happening indirectly, but no, that's not what I was thinking at all.
Well, it is one of those things that if you develop your shadow map accurately, it's going to reflect the planes, and it's going to reflect the anatomy. It's going to reflect all of that, but you don't have to be thinking about it while you're doing it. Whereas if you start with planes or start with anatomy, you have this challenge of trying to reconcile what you know versus what you see and how to put it together believably. And that's a much greater challenge. It can still absolutely be done. That's how all the great illustrators and animators of the past have worked, by having that understanding of planes and anatomy. But for a fine artist, especially one who's working off of observation, or at least learning off of observation, starting with this shadow pattern is infinitely easier and requires no knowledge. And we can just, therefore, have this luxury of using our knowledge as a correction tool as opposed to trying to use it to construct with. But yeah, it's interesting in how developing a shadow map like this takes care of a lot of the big challenges of drawing a figure. As long as you keep in mind that even though it is abstract shapes, some of them are shifting a little bit, so we have to deal with answering shapes. So, as the shadow map is being developed out, you work on the shadow map, and then you check it against the scheme, and then even as you're doing the scheme, you do check one side of the scheme and envelope versus the other side of the scheme and envelope, and they have to match.
Yeah, I promise you, if you work on one side directly, and you just work all one side, and you don't pay attention to the other side, when you go to that other side, it's not gonna match up. It's not gonna be right. It won't. It doesn't matter how perfect you made the other side.
Right. It's a perfect shape in isolation of all the other shapes is no longer a perfect shape.
Exactly.
So yeah, you could have hit all the angles right and all the lengths right, but if it's in the wrong spot, then it's useless. We have to figure out how to shift it over. In this case, where I was developing the leg and the kneecap, my answering shape was actually the anchor by the glutes, where she's seated on the on the couch. And so, as I was measuring each of those, I had to measure to her backside there to make sure those that they reconciled. Otherwise, the length of the leg would be wrong, and it wouldn't matter if I get all of the kneecap angles and the lower leg angles correct. Keep in mind too that even as I'm developing this shadow map out, the ultimate intent of this is going to be kind of similar to how the portrait was handled, in that I'm going to kind of work one section at a time and develop it out, and then base some of my other decisions off of that. So in this case, it's going to be the torso. My intent is that after this one day of shadow mapping, I'm going to begin working on the torso, and I'm going to commit as much energy as I need to, a day or two, a session or two with the model, to build it up and get it accurate before I start adding the limbs on. And as a result, some of this may end up changing. As I flush out the torso, it might shrink a little or grow just a little bit, which could ultimately affect some of the other measurements, even by millimeters on the paper. But of course, we know millimeters matter here. So if my torso grows a millimeter, my leg might have to grow 1 or 2 millimeters. So I just have to be open to that possibility that even though I'm spending a lot of time with my measurements here, I need to remain a little bit flexible because there's definitely a potential for human error on my part, with all the measurement and rendering. There's also potential for the model shifting a little bit from session to session, and maybe maybe next time when she gets there, she ends up sitting up a little bit straighter when I'm rendering the torso, so I end up drawing it just a little bit bigger. And in that case, I have to just remain flexible to these alterations. Now, I won't change anything if they're huge changes, like if her shoulders slope down dramatically and it's a different posture, obviously we would correct the model. But if they're tiny little changes, I can just adopt them for the most part into my drawing without having to run the risk of making too many new measurements and new alterations. But what I do find is that students are really hesitant about remaining flexible and open to the idea that some things may have to be remeasured, some things may have to change a little bit, because we're kind of used to that comfort and familiarity that we saw in term 1 and in still life in term 2, where the objects aren't moving. So if you spend all of this time in the beginning measuring out the shadow map, then you're never going to have to measure again. And so they don't want to change anything else ever again because they feel like they've done all the measuring work. But we have to remember that we need to be open to this idea that some subtle alterations can happen, and that the whole idea behind a drawing or painting is that it's a problem-solving experience. And so we're doing our best to follow this process, which is intended to help mitigate rework and minimize the inaccuracies here. But ultimately, we're going to have to use our best judgment here. And in that case, we may end up deviating from the rigid nature of, say, a barred plate process. And that's kind of hard for some students to accept because they found so much comfort in this process and the consistent results.
Yeah, so I think that relates to just fear then, and then experience is what's going to make them feel better.
Right, absolutely, yeah.
Just trying it.
And and every once in a while, being open to the idea of deviating a little bit from this set rigid process. This rigid process is in place to give everybody a starting point. But the real tools that you've learned in this program are how to measure, the concepts of shape, value, and edge, and a refinement of your ability to see shapes, as well as a little bit of knowledge on shadow anatomy and light anatomy and human anatomy. So those are kind of the tools you've been given here, and you have to rearrange those tools in as many combinations as you can to solve all of the problems that jump up with a figure drawing. And we can't just throw in the towel or get discouraged or complain when the process isn't working out as well as we hope it's working out. We just have to accept that and figure out what tools we can utilize to solve the challenges that are in front of us. And that's tough, and that's where it starts to separate the men from the boys, so to speak. I guess the ones who can kind of become independent thinkers, which are the ones who are ultimately going to catalyst themselves to becoming really strong, great artists. Everybody can be trained to do a reasonably good figure drawing or portrait, especially if they're working from a two-dimensional source or a model that doesn't move very much. But not everybody is going to achieve the amazing results of the masters. It's only those of us who can utilize all the tools we're given to solve complex and new challenges that are presented to us, which is, it's a whole nother level of thinking and a whole nother level of challenge, and it's something that we just don't get to address enough in the academy here in the course of 1 year of drawing. I'm laying in some charcoal now here. So
that
this
looks like your 2B then?
Yeah, it's my 2B. And I'll, as I'm doing this here, you can see I'm slowly refining the shapes a little bit here, which I can do now because it's I'm seeing it more in terms of shape. Before it was all that linear nature. Now we're dealing with shapes, and now I can actually fine-tune to an even greater degree shift those lines a millimeter here or a millimeter there. And this is the second pose, or second sitting with the figure. Oh, I'm sorry. It is still the first sitting with the figure. But we're getting close to the end of the first sitting with the figure.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if the idea of the challenge is discouraging to you rather than kind of exciting, you might want to kind of reevaluate how you just how you feel, you know.
Right.
And it doesn't have to be discouraging. It doesn't have to be this kind of daunting, like dreaded
Right.
thing, you know. I mean, I know personally, I'm just the type that loves a challenge. So I get, you know, do I get a little down if I don't do something perfect? Yeah, because I have some perfectionism in me as well. But I also get kind of excited when I do something wrong, but figure out what it is or fix it. Fixing it to me is much nicer and a much better experience than doing it right the first time.
Right.
You know, sure. I mean, that might sound weird, but I don't know. I think it's helped me.
You're learning how to overcome challenges, and unfortunately, you know, that sort of problem-solving thing is really hard to teach. All we can do here is present a lot of the tools that we and other artists and historical artists have used in the past with their problem-solving abilities, and then each of us have to do the best we can with them. And you know, a lot of people do art for different reasons, and some people do art because they enjoy the process and it makes them feel good, and those people don't often enjoy a lot of the frustration and challenge that can come with a figure drawing like this. You know, like if we look at someone like Bob Ross, who's actually not a bad painter, right?
Bob Ross.
Yeah, everybody loves Bob, and it's, you know, it's fun to paint along with Bob Ross, and it's an enjoyable experience. And doing art for that reason is specific, and you know, that's why a lot of people take classes. They want to meet people, have a good time, maybe learn a little bit. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just when we start to get into drawing and art making on this level, you have to be in it for a different set of reasons. Because if you're just coming to class to have a good time and enjoy the process, it's probably going to prevent you from focusing on the real challenges at hand. And you should be coming because you're excited about this challenge and you feel like you're going to conquer this drawing if you can just solve all of these problems. Because the challenges are never going to stop. Even, you know, we talked about that a little bit with the portrait drawing in the portrait drawing videos, that even if you start to overcome and solve these challenges of, you know, how to draw a portrait or how to draw a figure, there's going to be new challenges that are consistently presenting themselves, and we can either throw in the towel or we can rise to the occasion and solve new problems. And if you're somebody who enjoys the challenge of solving problems, then this is going to be something that's really enjoyable to you. But the actual process might not be very enjoyable. And, you know, for a long, long time, I didn't like painting very much. You know, I enjoyed drawing for the most part, but painting was really hard, and the process, I hated cleaning up. And I still didn't understand color very much. But I always enjoyed the product, and so I always enjoyed the victory if I got a good painting. And so those victories and overcoming the challenges is what kept driving me to do it. It wasn't because I enjoyed, you know, waking up really early and taking a train down to the palette and chisel and painting every day, half asleep. I was painting because I enjoyed the challenge and because I wanted to solve the problems and come up with an end product that I could be proud of. It's just a different mindset. So notice I've built up a little bit of value variation with my lights. My darks are actually pretty similar, but my lights do have some variation in them. And now I'm just kind of massaging some of this white chalk into the drawing. It's a more textured paper, The last tone drawing we saw was the long pose portrait, and that was on a pretty smooth um, tone paper, actually, that green paper. This one you can actually see is pretty textured, and so even as I've started to work it in the torso, we're seeing a lot of that gritty texture, which is not something I'm going to want to have the drawing end with. It's the goal here, especially with a 7-session figure drawing, which is 21 hours, and then some breaks. The idea is that I'm not only going to have an accurate figure drawing, but I get a chance to really focus on some of my finishes and develop the drawing to be either smooth or have the sort of appearance of porous textures. So that's ultimately going to be my goal here. So there's going to be a lot of cleanup work I'm going to have to do, which ultimately I'll do a lot of it at home when the model's not there, because I don't need to see the model for a lot of it. But here I'm trying to establish a basic value relationship with the stump. Again, remember, my goal is to try and hit it so that I've managed to capture a value relationship where my lights are just a little bit darker than the final value is going to be, so that as I clean it up and fill it in, it gets really close to that final value. What we'll end up seeing here, which ends up taking a little bit more time with this video, is that I overshoot that value a little bit. I make the lights a little bit too light, so when I fill it in, I think some of the lights end up too strong and have to get knocked back down again. And so there's a little bit of that back and forth there, but it's like what we talked about. It's all about overcoming the challenge. I didn't just accept the fact that it was a little too light. I wanted to make it better, so I spent the time to go back, correct it, and then approach it a little more slowly than I initially did the first time. And this is what I see very frequently when, especially with guys. Guys tend to be very shoot straight from the hip and try to hit the nail on the head so that they don't waste any time. And as a result, they end up overshooting some values and have a lot more back and forth. Females, for the most part, women tend to be a little more gentle going into it. And they're okay with patiently building up a drawing for the most part. And I'm not really sure why that is. But it's something that I've seen consistently for the last couple of years.
I mean, so you're obviously trying to get all your values in the right place from the get-go.
Mm-hmm.
You've also said that it's pretty rare that you hit the nail right on the head.
Yeah.
In that way. Is it better to overshoot or undershoot?
Oh, absolutely undershoot.
Okay.
Yeah. Because then you're not doing this back and forth and back and forth. If you know for sure that everything is a little bit, for example, all the lights are a little bit darker than they need to be, all the darks are a little bit lighter than they need to be, then you know that all you have to do is clean it up and then see what little marks you need to make, or if you need to veil a little bit more. And so it's sort of that safer way to keep all of the charcoal that's on top of the drawing just a little more loose and workable. If we do a lot of this erase and then put back in, and then erase and put back in, we start to get some unpleasant, aesthetically displeasing smudges and marks on the paper. The paper fibers end up getting worn down and become less able to accept charcoal. The surface can get burnished and slick and have sort of a wax-like appearance, which will look a little strange, as well as make it difficult to modify the drawing in any way. So there's a lot of disadvantages if you end up overshooting the drawing. And if you do it more than once or twice, if you keep going back and forth and back and forth, you end up making a drawing that's just too unworkable, and you sometimes have to just start over with a new, transfer to a new paper and begin building up the values again, which I have seen a lot. And that's what ends up happening a lot with people's projects at home, is that they end up working the paper so much because they're going back and forth that the paper is no longer workable, and they have to retransfer and start all over again. It just ends up being a lot of time spent. So I am working in a studio with a natural light on my board. There's not a natural light on the model. It's actually just artificial on her. But for filming purposes, I had wanted natural light on here because it coaxes out some better colors generally. But what we end up seeing here in the background is a huge shift in value and a little bit of a shift in color throughout this, probably the first 3 or 4 sessions of the video. So after I get the torso done, I pretty much close the window and use artificial light on my board, and then things stay a little bit more consistent after that. But I do tend to like to work with natural light on my canvas and usually on my model too, because it ends up shifting a little bit, especially with painting, and then you can kind of pick and choose some of the colors that stand out as most pleasing to you. It's sort of the same idea, we talked about a little bit earlier with having a model that moves just a little bit. Having light that shifts just a little bit here and there allows us to select some of the more beautiful or pleasing color combinations there. And I know some artists who like this so much to the point where they've gone to the effort of constructing light boxes with combinations of lights in which some are on dimmers and some have color temperature shifts so that it can mimic the idea of clouds passing overhead, just so that they can have a more natural experience with the model. So here, this is, after the stumping, this is my first pass at coaxing out some more fine-tuned value relationships. So the initial laydown of chalk and charcoal with the stumping in there established my base, and now I'm coming in here with the eraser, you can see, and really trying to fine-tune some of the values as much as I can. So I'm working with the model here, still trying to push this as much as I can before the end of the first session here, so that when I leave, I can go and just do a bunch of filling in of the dots, which would allow me to come back the next session and then just do a fine-tuned touch here and there to finish off the torso. So that's my intent right now. I'm trying to work around, fine-tune all of the value relationships to set myself up to be able to fill in all the dots and clean it all up without the model. See, it's a lot of working the transition. There's a big challenge students have with the white chalk and the charcoal. I think we may have mentioned it before, where the meeting of the two, they're not really sure how to handle it. And so there ends up being kind of like a bar of paper or a line of paper running between the charcoal and the white chalk. But here you can see, I've stumped up to the boundaries of each, and now I'm just kind of lifting up with the click eraser on the lights. And that's helping to darken the value. So when I'm erasing into the white chalk, it's almost as if I'm drawing with charcoal on the white chalk. And when I erase into the charcoal, it's almost as if I'm drawing with white chalk on the charcoal. It's kind of a nice tool to use after that initial stumping, because I can just bounce back and forth as long as I keep cleaning off my pencil or my eraser. That's what I'm doing each time my eraser comes down. I'm wiping it off so I don't spread any charcoal or chalk around the drawing. And I'm just trying to develop a more subtle relationship of values throughout the drawing. A lot of it is still squinting. I'm just squinting and flicking my eyes back and forth and back and forth and back and forth as I take out kind of these veils, so to speak, with the eraser. And notice I'm not really concerned about finishes yet. I don't really care that the texture is kind of gritty and I don't know, chunky, or I don't even know how to describe it. It's kind of strange. But I'm not really concerned about that. I'm just concerning myself with these value relationships and trying to push them as fine-tuned as I can, just with the eraser here.
I can see there's not a whole lot of like eraser, like leftover eraser on the page. So that to me says that you're not really digging too hard into that page then.
Absolutely, that's a great point. Yeah, I'm really not cranking into the page. I know that the chalk and charcoal has been, for the most part, lightly stumped in. I remember I said I massaged it in. I didn't really like jam it into the paper. And so as a result, some of those top layers are still a little bit loose, which is allowing me to just sort of pick up a little bit with the eraser. And what you'll end up finding later on, and you'll see me actually do later on, which is kind of interesting, is that if you are able to keep this top layer sort of light enough, not in terms of value, but in terms of your application, like loose powder enough, then you'll actually be able to take a clean stump and just slide it over, say, an area of the white and lift off a little bit of that chalk and lower the value just a hair. And so you can end up doing even finer value adjustments with that stump than the eraser. And this is a technique that we have not talked about yet. I've even gone out of my way to say, don't try to modulate values with the stump. Just modulate it with the pencil veils. But that's more referring to trying to push value around with the stump. Whereas what I'm talking about here, what we're going to see in a little bit, is me just gently, ever so softly lifting up a little value and taking it away, which it's very different. And it requires a very, very delicate, soft touch. But it is a delicate, soft touch that is going to be required for when we get to painting. Because we're going to be working wet paint on top of wet paint. And if you don't have a soft touch, you're going to ruin all your colors and values. We've gone back in here now. I'm working with the pencils again just to build up a few more of those values.
Yeah, I think that's one thing I've appreciated and has stuck with me from the beginning is your teaching on how to be sensitive and the use of materials, which I had never really been taught in that way before. Because I think I always associated energy or looseness or sensitivity that I might see in a drawing with kind of this rough use of whatever it is that you're using to draw, And I don't know why. I think that that's a really interesting point, though. I mean, you've always taught us to kind of be really specific about the way you use all of your tools and kind of respecting them. That includes, your paper and yeah, that's helped me a lot.
Good. Yeah, it's something that I don't hear a lot of artists talk about in great deal. At least, when we're talking about charcoal drawings like this. This super soft, delicate touch, this superb command of soft control over your materials. But and that's the very reason why we have to push it so much, because when we get to painting, it's just impossible to do a painting. And I've just run into a lot of frustration trying to instruct on painting when people are just so blunt with the brush. Especially, when they come to me to learn, because what they're coming to learn from me often is the sensitive, subtle shifting of colors and values and brush work, which you can't do if you don't have this control. And I know there's some people out there, and I still have students in class, saying, "Oh, well, my arm's not strong enough, or I'm too shaky," or there's a lot of that people say. But I can assure you that I am as well. And it's it's a skill that you do develop over time. But remember, we have maul sticks if your hand's not steady. And when we get to painting, you're going to have to use a maul stick when your canvas is wet. You can't rest your hand on your canvas. So that's not anything to be worried about. And also, we're doing a lot of small straight lines here. All this shading and all this delicate erasing and stumping is all done with these sort of tiny straight line marks, which even if your hands are shaky, people can do reasonably well. And so, I've had a lot of students come into the program sort of with that mentality, but by the end of the first term, that's usually gone. So here I was having a little trouble on the breast because right on the bottom side of that breast, that's where it's hitting the division between light and dark, and it's just such a subtle turn and such a subtle value shift as opposed to some of the more obvious shadow mapping areas that I've had to go, play with it a little back and forth. And I'm also adjusting the shape a little bit too. I have to compare it from the bottom where she's sitting on the couch, and then also compare it from the top shoulders down, just to sink the shadow portion of the breast in the right spot. Still doing a lot of heavy measuring. Actually, if I'm not mistaken, I think the growth of that shoulder right there, by that small amount, later on in the drawing, you'll notice it results in me changing the length of the leg a little bit. But you know, that is why we give ourselves an inch border minimum. And then if slight millimeter changes happen, we can still stay within the boundaries of the paper. One of the biggest goals we try to hit here in class is never having to cut things off at ankles or kneecaps or inappropriate places. And again, that's another prepping for painting thing. We're treating this as if it were on a stretched canvas, and we can't change the size of it for whatever reason. So I'm putting some background in here, you know, to help me better gauge the values of the figure, just like in the plaster cast drapery drawing. And I think my original intent here also was that I was going to finish this drawing all the way out. I was going to include the background and include some of the chair that she's sitting on as well. What ultimately happens is I don't have enough time with the model to do that. And so I'm faced with this dilemma of doing the entire background without the model, or just erasing out what I had placed in for the background. And for the aesthetics of the drawing, I thought it would actually be nicer to erase it out. So all of this background that you see being laid in behind the model ultimately disappears. So it ends up being a little bit of time consumption there, but it's not necessarily time wasted, because putting that background shape in like I just did ultimately really helps me figure out the values of the torso there. And then when later on, I'll end up putting some background by the arm, and that really helps me sort out the values of the arm, which ultimately we find out are very, very, very close to the value of the paper. And it would be difficult for me to have sorted through that if the values of the arm and the values of the paper were the same, because there would be almost no separation there. Now, I think what does ultimately hurt me a little bit is that I did sync the value of that little sort of triangle background piece between the arm and the torso. I made it too light. So you can see that now, and as a result, some of the decisions I'm making in the torso now are too light, because I'm keying them off that background shape that I did not spend enough time making sure was exactly right. So again, we're going to end up seeing some wasted time here, a little backtracking, but again, it's all part of the process. Luckily, it's you know, it was identified before it was too late. And actually, it was because after I did my first pass at filling in all these dots, I realized that the torso was just looking really, really light. So I had to start to reevaluate why it was looking so light, because I had taken a break and I came back, and when I came back, it just wasn't adding up.
Yeah,
Something was bothering me.
I was going to say, when did you kind of see that after stepping back, taking a break?
Yeah, it was yeah, not even just a break. It was sessions between models. Yeah, like a whole day, you know. And again, I was presented with that. Well, two options: either raise all the values of the darks so that I key everything higher and possibly a little less naturally. Which, again, if we're going to painting, that's not the option we want, because then we get washed out colors. Versus the other option, which is pulling back on all the lights. And ultimately, that's what I end up doing. But I think that's important to point out. And one of the reasons why it's nice to show these videos as opposed to just a step-by-step in a book, like if we look at the Academy textbook, because you don't get to see as many of the problems being worked through. And we kind of tend to have this idea or assumption that all of these great painters that we see are all doing these fantastic works, and it's like no effort to them whatsoever. And sometimes it goes that way, for sure. But almost always, there's some issue that has to be worked through. And that's why a lot of artists like their own studios, and they like to paint on their own, because you need to feel secure and safe enough to be able to make some of these mistakes and then to give yourself the luxury of trying to spend some time to figure them out. And it happens to every artist. Eventually you make less and less and less of these mistakes, and especially the more you're working too. I hadn't done a long drawing like this in a very, very long amount of time because I've been occupied doing other things, and so it was sort of like one of those things where I had to just remember everything. And luckily, I'm still teaching 2 days a week, so I have all of those phrases and things that I'm saying in class pop into my head, which helps me as well. But there is still a certain amount of problem solving that I'm having to do as well. And so it's just a good example where it ultimately relies on your problem solving skills here. So I think this shoulder will probably end up getting a little too light as well. Now, keep in mind, I'm getting close to the end of the first session with the model, and I'm going into the arm, which is not something I would commonly even recommend for students. I would say really devote your attention on developing the torso out. But I do try to keep to mostly just the shoulder area of the arm. And I do feel that was helpful to me because it gave me sort of 3 spots of light that I could compare to each other. So it was the side of the hips there, the breast, and the shoulder. So when I have 3 shapes, it's easier to create a relationship than when I just have 2 shapes. I can figure out all the steps and see if those steps interlock to the darks correctly. So I won't render any more of the arm out, but just the shoulder area here.
Do you think students would be tempted to work more on that hand and that arm in this particular sitting, like while say they've gotten this far? I think I would be tempted to go to the hand.
Oh, would you?
Yeah,
yeah,
I would.
I know. Well,
just a little more, I think. I don't know why.
It's well, usually what'll happen is if students can develop a drawing this far, they don't really know what to do next. And in that case, they would definitely go to an adjacent limb. But I try to just remind myself when that temptation arises that I've sort of set a schedule for myself in the figure drawing, so I should take the luxury of trying to force myself into pushing the sensitivity of the values of, in this case, the torso, as far as I can. And instead of feeling like I'm wasting time and bouncing to another section, just feel like, okay, well, I've earned the luxury to spend a little more time making my decisions. So now instead of working furiously like you kind of see me working here, I'll sort of sit back and think about my drawing a little more, and then look at the model and think about the model, and go back and forth, because each of those finer adjustments takes more thought power and more observation to do. And students, I think, sometimes feel the time pressure here, and they feel like they don't have the time to stop and slow down and give themselves that thought process. If they're not deliberately or quickly putting marks on the page, then they're wasting time with the model. Which could be the case if they're just not making any progress. But if you get to this point and you still have time left in your sort of predetermined sitting, and that temptation for students always arises, and usually it's like the head. They start putting information in the head at this point. I just recommend first taking a break if it's been a little while, and then coming back and just spending a lot more time to try and get as close as you can. So you can see me, I've been sort of sculpting and adding information and adjusting now little tiny value increments for quite a while now on this torso. Just trying to give myself that luxury here before moving on. Remember, I'm not sure if we mentioned this, but one of the reasons we do stay away from the head at this point of the game, I think we may have talked about it in the shadow mapping of the figure, is first of all, we haven't really gone through all of our portrait drawing. If you're working on this at home, I think the recommendation was actually to do portrait all the way through first and then do figure. So in that case, you can start with the head. If you're confident in your portrait drawing skills, begin there and work your way down. But be careful about utilizing the head as a unit of measurement, because almost every instance where I've seen that done, it's caused the figure to be stretched out and elongated to the point where like the ankles are cut off or shrunk down substantially, because that little head can create a lot of stacked inaccuracies as we use it as a unit of measurement, as opposed to using the whole figure width compared to the height, which is where you should start, and then you can figure out the head unit in relation to that overall box. And that process actually is listed in the Academy textbook, although it's not something that we talk about as much now, just because I found that students were using the head too much as a unit of measurement, which was distorting all of their proportions. So now, even though it's in the Academy textbook, we don't really talk about it too much. I think there's an exercise area in the back of the book where it gives the student a bunch of images, and then it says, okay, well, now use comparative measurement to put it on the page and find the proportional box, and then find the head box, and then set that inside. But we just don't have students do that anymore. But again, if you're working at home, you've developed a strong ability for portraiture, then you can go ahead and start with the head, which would be our historical method. The historical method would be to put the tick marks for the boundaries of the figure, maybe set a plumb line in there, and then figure out the head, and then just sort of work your way down from there.
Using the head as to measure the rest of the body is a really common teaching.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know where that came from?
It was probably from the academies.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what I was taught from the time I was, I want to say probably junior high.
Yeah.
Certainly, that was it.
And if you're slow enough and sensitive enough with your comparative measurements, there's absolutely nothing wrong with doing that. But what I find is students aren't as sensitive as they think they are with their measurements. And that's something where we're dealing with a small unit, so we have to be extra precise. And students just don't take that into consideration, I think. So, it can be successfully utilized, but we have to make sure we're trained up in all of our adjacent areas, comparative and side size triangulation, etc. Remember that when this was taught in academies and they instructed students to do that, they had spent a ton of time doing the bar plates and still life and all that sort of stuff. All of that training was mastered by the students before beginning a figure drawing, which was infinitely more complex. So it was expected that the student already had all of these skills before dealing with the figure, so that you're really focused on the challenges of working with a live model instead of the challenges of how to do comparative measurement when you're looking at the model. So notice I did go in and add some slightly deeper shadows in the breast and sort of the core shadow on the one breast. Now I'm going to core shadow on the shoulder there, just sort of increasing the three-dimensionality of the form here. Notice how long I waited to do that. I really wanted to flesh out some of the accurate shapes before working the cores.
This is still the first sitting.
You know what? I think we are into the second sitting here, which we may have been for a little while now. I don't think I quite finished the torso to my satisfaction in the first sitting. And I think it comes down to something like we've got maybe 2 hours and 10 minutes or 2 hours and 20 minutes with the model out of a 3-hour day, which, as you can see by now, I've been working for 2 hours and 40 minutes actually at this point. So, and I think the setup was a little slower because part of the session was figuring out how to set the model. So it looks like the shadow mapping was probably done the first session, and then some of the shading is, or a lot of the shading here is done on the second session.
What's the size of the drawing?
Well, the sheet I think is an 18 by 24, so the width of the figure is something like 16 inches. So it's probably close to 16 by 16 overall. So depending on the size of your monitor, you're probably seeing this pretty close to life size right now. One thing I've generally told students in other classes is that when you're doing a figure drawing, you do have to make sure that the three things you really make sure are accurate are the face, the hands, and the breasts, because that's where everybody's looking immediately. And then they start to look at other areas of the figure drawing. So if you have any one of those three that are strange looking or awkward, then it's going to really lose the credibility of your drawing. Keep in mind also, I've got a lot of sharp pencils on hand here while I'm doing this. I think I've got 4 HBs and 4 2Bs to do all of this work in here. And you can see I'm still doing that sort of rotation thing. Whenever it gets a little too dull, I rotate the pencil to find a sharp point. And then when the pencil is just not satisfying me enough anymore, I set it down and switch to the next one. And then on each break here, I'm actually just buffing my pencils with a sanding block.
So you would definitely get the torso squared away before you moved on to any other part of the body.
Yeah, I would
as
give
far
it
as
my
your
best
values
shot. Yeah.
and
And my intent would be to resolve it by the end of the session, or in this case, it's going to be resolved by the end of the second session. First session with the shadow map, hopefully second session with the torso. So that when I come back the following session, I can check and adjust it as needed before moving on. But the more you can resolve a single area like the torso here in one sitting, the better odds you have of everything being pretty similar. The model typically has pretty good muscle memory from sitting to sitting, but if we're talking about a week or a couple days or a week or whatever in between poses, it can change enough to cause noticeable difference, and it might be really hard to get the model back into pose. So it's kind of like that alla prima mindset where we're just trying to resolve it just in case something happens and we can't get the same view back or the same model back. We're just trying to get as much correct information as we can right up front. And that's another thing too why I'm spending, and I will spend, substantially more time on the torso actually than any other area of the body here, because as I develop other relationships, I want them to be developed based off of a set of relationships that's really strong and really accurate. And otherwise, I would be making my decisions off of poor information. So I don't want to advance the arm and hand and legs and face too much at all before I've got something substantially accurate with the torso. I'm also finally now starting to think about anatomy as well, um, and use that to help guide some of my choices for adjusting the proportions and measurements.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of the stage that we were at with the model's right eye in the long portrait
Yeah,
sitting.
that's pretty much exactly where we're at right now. Yeah. Now I didn't stump in the whole figure drawing like I did then,
Mm-hmm.
but the rest of the shadow map was done, and it's the same exact idea. I want to resolve this and use it as my guideline for how I'm going to develop the rest of the drawing, as far as not just value structure and not just edge structure, but also in level of finish.
Mm-hmm.
And it's great to do that with your first shape, because then you don't end up with a drawing that's unresolved. And so I've kind of set some timeline boundaries for when I have to have the torso done, so that I can still have time to finish the rest of the drawing. And so it's essentially, as far as I can get this resolved, for the most part, that's how I'm going to key the rest of it. And then if I have time, I can go back and bring up some of the uh, areas a little bit more, or break them up and fine tune them a little bit more, if there's enough time. So you notice I do measure that sort of armpit area quite a lot.
Mm-hmm.
It's a hard pose. The model's having to adjust a little bit as we go through to maintain that. So some of these uh, minor changes keep happening, and you'll notice that I'm always trying to relate it to more than one side. I'm not just measuring up from the bottom, but I'll measure it from the bottom and then over from the side and then from the top, and measure from angles and things like that, to try and make the most informed decision. And also, I'm trying to remember too that if that armpit raises or lowers, then the trapezius has to raise or lower as well. Which at this point, it's still kind of masked by a little bit of hair, which is kind of nice, because then I sort of have a little bit of liberty. But I will have to start thinking about that a little later. This also is a shape that will constantly get refined. Again, as the model sort of keeps her balance and adjusts and finds her comfort level to make sure she doesn't fall off the stand here. So I'm trying to take angles, and I'm trying to take plums, and I'm checking answering shapes against the opposite side, also checking it against the other breast, just to make sure that any changes I make still fit into the drawing I have established. You don't want to just keep chasing little changes in the model, and that's a big error that I see a lot in students, and that's sort of the source of the whole the model moved argument. Well, you don't have to necessarily change your drawing if the model shifts. You need to make an educated, deliberate decision as to whether or not what you have looks believable, and if it's looking a little off, is the shift of the model going to fix the drawing if you capture that shift. And if there's no purpose in altering your drawing to match a slightly new position of the model, like it's not going to enhance the believability or the plausibility of the model or the beauty of the pose, then there's no reason to do it. And it shouldn't even matter if the model shifts. You're just not even paying attention to it.
Just leave it.
Just leave it, yeah.
Yeah, sometimes I'll just leave it. Like if it's not, if by changing it, it doesn't affect the drawing in a positive way, then and by leaving it, if it doesn't affect the drawing in a negative way, then
right,
yeah, just certainly just leave it. Can you explain a little bit more? You use the term chasing a lot. Can you describe what that means a little bit more so students can be really aware?
Yeah, that's a good point. So this is something you'll hear a lot of artists talk about. when they're teaching, and it's making any change to your drawing because the model has made any particular change on the stage. And so whether it's a big change or a small change, some models are really good, so the adjustments they make are very, very slight. And some models get really bored or uncomfortable or have difficulty holding pose, so they shift their body or their head substantially. And some students get frustrated and will change their drawing to match the new pose of the model. And then, the next sitting, the model adjusts to something else, and the student gets frustrated and changes their drawing to match the new position. And this can go on and on and on to the point where the student barely gets any work done. And so when I come over to ask, what's going on? How can we, or why is the drawing not progressing? The answer is, oh, well, the model's moving. And essentially, they're just chasing the pose each time. Each time there's a change made up there, they're trying to do the change on their board. Which is not necessarily a viable method of working, because we're just not going to make any progress with the drawing if we keep altering it every time the model moves. And we have to think the model is a breathing human being. Every time she breathes, she moves. And so we can't just keep changing our drawing impulsively based off of subtle changes in the model. We have to make these deliberate decisions, like you said, about, is changing the drawing going to improve the quality of the drawing as far as the accuracy, or is leaving it going to be fine? If it's not going to improve the accuracy, or I should say believability of the drawing, then there's no need to change it. So we have to make sure we're clear now on believability versus accuracy. And so, when we talk about accuracy, we say, does the drawing you have match the reference that's up there? Now, hopefully it does, but in the case of a shifting model, it's possible that you're going to have areas that at some points don't match how the model is posed because they were having to adjust their posture. And so you may have a drawing that's not 100% accurate to what's up there, but it's still believable because perhaps you establish correct relationships, or when you drew that particular piece of anatomy, it was accurate, and
so was your answering shape.
And so was the answering shape. And not only was it accurate, but it also fits into the rest of the figure and anatomy that you have on the drawing. So in that case, you have a believable drawing, which is essentially, in the end, that's the most we can hope for. Unless we're working from a photo reference that's pretty fixed, all we can ask is that we're drawing something that is believable, so that when somebody looks at it, they don't think that something is weird or incorrect about the drawing. And chasing the shapes or chasing the pose won't necessarily improve the believability of the drawing. You may subtly improve the accuracy each sitting, but you're going to change each time. So you won't advance the drawing. You'll just be continually maintaining accuracy to what the reference is. And so ultimately, if you don't end up with a drawing, then there's not really a whole point to doing much of it. So we have to learn to make, again, and this is a sort of a problem-solving decision that's really hard to teach. We have to learn to know when the limit and boundary is to what believability is, which can be hard to articulate. And that's why we've had a lot of anatomy classes, because those lecture classes are intended to inform you on sort of what the standard of things should look like. But in general, we all have a pretty high ability, I think, at least for portrait and figure, to look at a drawing or painting and say whether or not it looks convincing. It's really hard to do in our own work, I would say, especially in the beginning. It's easy to do in other people's work. You can go to another student's work and say, oh, that doesn't look believable really easily. But then when you look at your own, we try to convince ourselves, like, yeah, well, they looked like that at one point. And so we have to learn that sort of detachment and objectivity, so that when we're looking at our own drawing, we can ask ourselves if it's believable, or you can ask somebody else. You shouldn't necessarily ask your fellow students what needs to be fixed, but you can certainly ask someone if it looks believable or not. And ultimately, this is how we judge each of the assignments that are turned in for final projects in term 2 and term 3. is just whether or not it's believable with what we, the judges or the professional artists, know and have encountered in our experience. And that's just something that eventually you're going to have to learn and develop the ability to identify. But one of the recommendations, at least for portraiture, that I give to people is show your drawing to a child, like a 5 or 6 year old, because they usually have no filter. And they don't mean to be mean, but they just they lay it out how it is. So if they think it's a believable portrait, they'll say something like, "Oh wow, that looks just like Noto," or "That looks really good." And if it's not a believable portrait, they'll say something like, "Oh, that looks weird," or "Why is that face so droopy?" or something like that. Just innocent observation without a filtration process, and that's ultimately that's probably the best critiques you can get. Whereas older people will either try to be more supportive, like, "Yeah, that looks great, keep on going," or they'll try to give you advice that sort of leads you in the wrong direction, which I think we've kind of talked about before.
Mm-hmm.
And really, it should be up to you to figure out how to resolve the problems of your drawing. All you should be concerned about is whether or not somebody thinks it's believable, and if it's not believable, how do you need to adjust it to make it believable?
Yeah, if you're feeling sensitive, maybe don't ask the child that day.
Yeah,
if you want to
make sure you're aware.
Yeah,
or you're prepped.
Get ready. Part of me kind of feels like it's strongly possible that a student who is a chaser, a consistent chaser, is probably looking at too small of areas too soon.
Yeah,
I feel like that would definitely go hand in hand.
Absolutely.
Because I don't really find myself doing that because I've remembered, you constantly are telling us to keep things just really, basic, too specific, so.
Yeah, build the complexity on the drawing instead of jumping right to the little small areas. And you're right, chasers do jump to small areas. Whereas if you're working from the big overall idea, by the time you get to the smaller nuanced things, you wouldn't be chasing it.
You can finally lock that into place.
Yeah, even if the model's in a slightly different pose, you can take that information and lock it into what you have. And there's not a huge challenge there. But if you jump ahead too soon, then you're just
you
chasing.
Get hung up on that little spot
absolutely.
When it doesn't really matter yet. So you're bringing that value up there, huh? On the torso.
Yeah, I knocked it down a little bit, and now I'm trying to build up some of the actually sculptural qualities of it. You can see I'm again going across and with the form a little bit, trying to indicate some of the more subtlety in the value in the torso. But I'm actually kind of reaching a limit here of how far I'll be able to go before I start filling in some of the dots and making it smooth to take it to that final level of finish. So I'm spending a little bit more time with the model now, and pretty soon coming up here, the session with the model will be done. And I have two choices. It's either leave the torso kind of the quality that it is, or fill in all the dots to try to advance it a little further. I don't want to really start filling in all these dots yet because I still have the model here. So I'm still trying to achieve as many little value changes as I can at this point. So I'm getting down to breaking into half value steps now maybe. But I won't be able to get into those like really tiny quarter steps and sub steps until I clean up some of the noise here. That's a term we've kind of thrown around before, is noise, and that's all that sort of grainy speckles and splotchiness, where we're seeing some of the toning of the paper speckled through with the white chalk. At this point, the tone of the paper is just so dark that these marks I'm making with the white chalk are looking really light and kind of glaring in comparison.
Before you mentioned that you caught yourself making this area too light.
Mm-hmm.
Had you already caught that and brought that down at this point, or are you?
Yeah, I think I did. Originally, I realized I had laid it too light to be able to build up the forms like I'm doing now, yeah.
Okay.
So I knocked it all down, and now I'm trying to build up the forms again. But what I'll find here is that my decision that I'm going to make by the end of this session is that I want to advance the finish of this beyond what it is now. Now, right now I'm establishing what I would consider a pretty correct relationship of shape, value, and edge here, which, if a student builds it up to this quality, that would be nice. It would still be a successful drawing, I would say. But ultimately what happens is I make a decision that I'm going to increase the level of finish and the level of smoothness beyond this. And as a result, when I fill in all those dots to do so, I'm going to find that the value, again, becomes too raised, and it's going to have to come back down. So it's going to require a little more time on this torso here, which is fine, because that's a decision I deliberately made, and I think it overall greatly increases the quality of the drawing in the long term. But again, like I said, it's going to end up costing a little bit more time. And if I had the intention earlier, it would have saved a little bit of time as well. So again, what we're seeing here is mostly sped up by about 200%, I think. And then when we get to the dot filling stage, that's when a lot of the time consumption comes in. So it's sped up to a level of 800%, so that we can really just get through that, so we can get back to when we're working with the model again. But it's important, watching these videos, to also watch the original videos that are included. I know it's a huge volume, so I probably wouldn't recommend the whole thing. This is 24 hours worth of footage that we're looking at sped up here. But it's important to at least pull it up and to see the speed at which some of these changes are happening, and especially when it gets into the dot filling stage, because it's basically going to look like I'm doing some turbo stippling coming up here, which it's kind of crazy looking, but it's good to look at the original clips to see exactly the speed that some of this stuff is happening, and you can get a better sense for the pressure that I'm applying when I'm doing that sort of stuff. Here I'm getting to the point where I'm even trying to include some of the anatomy within the torso here. So that's at the bottom of the ribs there, a little fold of skin. We've got some ribs and a little hint of some serratus showing as well in this torso. Now, they're not super pronounced. She hasn't developed her serratus to the point where they're really significant. Even her ribs aren't super prominent here. So as a result, this is, again, one of those situations where some students would just choose to kind of not indicate anything. And as a result, I think those drawings would end up being a little flatter or a little more sort of plastic or stiff or artificial. Yeah, tube-like, yeah. So it's instead the reverse, where you don't just go through it quickly and move on to something else. You have to spend more time on it so that you can be extra sensitive. We talked about that with the angle changes, but now we're talking about it with value changes. You have to be really slow and observant to be able to capture some of those little tiny subtle changes.
Definitely use that the mirror trick.
Oh yeah, absolutely. A good thing to do, we've mentioned it before, and it'll certainly put you off on the right track for all these figure drawings, is to also do a poster study before you start. We talked about doing the NOTAN to sort out the shadow mapping that you intend to do for your drawing, but a 5-value poster study will really help you get everything into a good starting value to begin to build up all of this anatomy and these relationships.
Would it be wrong for a student to do a poster study on the paper that they're eventually going to use? I mean, not the same paper, but the same, not on the same paper, but the same paper. Same paper tone.
The same paper tone.
Yeah.
And no, not necessarily. Obviously have to be working with paint to do that.
Right.
But yeah, you could leave the toning of the paper as one of the 5 values, theoretically, and then throw in a couple more to sort through the value assignments. Yeah, that's certainly fine. It'd be a good idea. So if I were going to do something like that here for this drawing, I would see that, or I would have identified that the forearm and part of the chest and part of the neck are actually going to be that paper tone as well. And then from there, it's lighter paint and darker paint. Remember, if you do a poster study, it could be a good idea to give yourself a few linear drawings to experiment with in case the first one doesn't turn out quite right. Okay, so we're filling in dots here. I've given us a zoomed in version. I'm no longer with the model. So this is after the model's left. And it's I'm using one of my sharp chalk pencils, and we've got I've got 4 of them altogether. So I'll use one for 3 to 5 minutes, and then it'll get a little dull, so I'll swap it out and use another one. And then every 20 minutes or so, I'll stop and I'll sharpen them up with the sanding block. But you can see I'm actually going pretty slow because this is sped up again 8 times. This is 800% the speed. And I'm just going through and ever so softly, as lightly as I can, I'm just tapping the paper actually, just so I can put a little bit of white chalk. Not too much. I don't want any glaring specks. And remember, this chalk has a wax binder in it, so if you press too hard and it leaves too much, it's going to be almost 3-dimensional, and it's going to be really, really shiny as well.
You'll know when you press too hard.
Yeah.
You'll be able to see it immediately and step away.
Absolutely, yeah. The light will actually pick it up a lot. And it becomes challenging too because it's not as easy to just tap out with the eraser. And if you do tap it out with the eraser, you take this huge chunk all the way around it too. And so it's going to require more time to fix and fill in. I think you end up seeing me do that later, so you'll see how it's done. But one of the things too, since I'm not looking at the model, I'm not really basing any of this off of anatomy or any observations of light or dark. I'm just selecting or determining what the majority of the chalk value is in a particular area, and I'm just bouncing around and filling it in.
And you're not looking at a photograph either.
No.
Right.
I've left the photo reference up there so you can actually kind of make a comparison to see how it looked to the model that was up there, but I'm not looking at a photo reference at this point. It's just filling in little bits and dots. And what you'll start to see is that as I fill it in, you end up raising the overall value of that particular area. So in this case, for example, the breast is now probably a little bit lighter than the picture-in-picture that we have there because I didn't set it down that value step in anticipation. This was something that the model had left, and after looking at the drawing later, I said to myself, well, you know what, I'd really like some of these marks to be a lot more subtle. I don't want them to be as pronounced as they are. So as a result, I've decided to fill in all the dots. Now, every once in a while, you'll see me stump that in, and that stumping, this is what we talked about here, that stumping was not to smush stuff around. It's actually to lift a little bit of this off and lower the value of it a little bit. And so as you can see, as I lift a little bit of that off, the breast gets a little more round because it's changing the value structure there. Because ultimately, to be able to stump the charcoal that I have in here into the paper, I would actually have to, and fill all those little holes, I would have to press really hard with the stump. And this is the error that students make with white chalk, because when you press really, really hard with that stump on white chalk, all that wax smushes together, and that's where you get that really slick wax surface that becomes difficult to erase and difficult to modify in terms of value. So when I was stumping it, it was really just to raise the value a little bit, and now I'm going in and filling in the dots. Now there was a little bit of, with that stumping, a little bit of pushing around that top layer of dust, which might have worked into the holes just a little bit, but there certainly wasn't any hard amount of stumping. It was very, very soft and very, very light. So now it's just a matter of, again, filling in all of these dots. I lowered the value with that stumping, and so now it's going to be a little bit closer when I fill some of this in. Just remember, you want your stump to be pretty clean when you try to lift off, like I was just doing.
Your stump looked a little funky. Did you shave it?
Yeah, I think I razor bladed it to get it a little cleaner.
That's a good tip.
Yeah. Yeah, you can use a sanding block as long as your sanding block's clean. You can also just use a razor blade like we did to sharpen the pencils. That way you can keep using your stump past just the regular normal use. Yeah, so when we see here, 20 minutes worth of filling in dots, again, that translates into 160 minutes. So literally just 2.5 hours of me sitting here at the easel filling in dots. So again, I don't want to do this when I'm with the model. That would be a huge waste of time. Paying the model for a 3-hour session when you're not even looking at the model because you're filling in dots, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So I encourage students to go home and do this stage of the process so that when they come back, they'll have a drawing that is really smooth and clean and allows them to make their finishing marks on top of it, which we're going to see in just a bit. Because after I fill these dots in, even though the value is going to be a little bit higher, it'll be very easy to modify the values lighter or darker. And I'll be able to make really, really sensitive decisions about how I should modify the value. Whereas before, when I had some of those marks that were just really glaring and really prominent, it would be really difficult for me to do some of the super quarter value steps or smaller that I want to have in this drawing.
What would you say to students who might be a little nervous about doing this away from the model because they're afraid they're gonna change the shapes or adjust something in the wrong way where it gives them more work later? What would you say?
Well, I would say ultimately keep in mind that you're going to have to spend more time with the model later anyway. Because there's, even after you fill in the dots, it is going to change the shapes a little bit. It is going to change the value a little bit. But the best advice to have is make sure your pencils are extra sharp and make sure you're pressing extra softly so that you don't end up altering the value beyond what it should be. So you can kind of see with this zoomed out version about how much the value should be modified. As I'm going to fill these dots in, you can see how different it is from the surrounding area. It's not a huge amount, but it is a very noticeable amount. The students that have had issues with this in the past that I've noticed, they've come back and all of a sudden their drawing is way darker if they've done it with the charcoal pencil, or way lighter if they've done it with the white chalk. And there's still all the splotches, still all the paper in between. And they say, well, I tried to fill in all the dots. And all they ended up doing was basically veiling everything because their pencils weren't sharp enough. As a result, as they went to go do these little dots in here, their pencil missed the little cracks and valleys and just hit the peaks of the paper tooth. So none of the dots were actually filled in because the pencil was just too dull. So your pencils have to be super sharp. Your touch has to be super light. And one of the things you may have noticed is that each time I lift my my hand, the paper moves a little bit and the board moves a little bit because they're not very rigid. And I want a little bit of light flexibility. The paper, or my board, is leaned ever so slightly forward. So my paper is actually just floating off of the board. So as I'm going in to make these marks, oh, there you go. I'm filling in that huge eraser splotch there. So as I'm going in to make these marks, I'm not actually pressing hard enough to even push the paper against the board. The paper is still kind of just floating there as I'm making these tiny little marks. And because of that, the marks have a very small amount of value change to them. And it's the reason why we pad papers, because it's the same sort of idea. You never want to press so hard that your paper is jammed against the board. You're always just really, really lightly touching the paper. And again, this is one of those things that directly translates into painting, because if you can't master that idea before we get to painting, you'll end up trying to make a brush stroke, and your pressure is going to be so hard that it's going to push out all of the paint that's underneath it and create sort of little ridges along your paint stroke. And so you'll have to be really careful, have this really, really light touch to be able to go in here and barely adjust the value. Really, really slow and steady here.
So when your hand's pulling away, I'm assuming that you're just kind of looking at it you're stepping back and looking at it from further away.
Yep, stepping
Maybe
back.
sharpening your pencil
Yes,
a little.
sometimes I'm sharpening the pencil. In that case, that last time my hand came away, I actually switched pencils out. You might have noticed, because the wood was a little different on them. Yeah, I think I just switched pencils again. A lot of that is switching pencils or just sharpening the pencils. I should have like color-coded the pencils so you could see how many times I was switching the pencils out. Yeah, it is very, very frequently. And remember, I'm only working 20 minutes before sharpening the pencils up again. But these pencils are pretty hard, so if you're pressing the appropriate amount, they should give you a nice point for 5 minutes or so. I've switched pencils again already.
The white pencils are a little more difficult to get a point with the razor blade.
Yeah,
so
you're right. Yeah,
don't be afraid to use the sanding.
For sure. Yeah.
For those.
Yeah. Get some wood taper there, and then get some white chalk exposed, and then switch over to the sanding block to develop the taper on that one. And a good tip for that is to go left and right on the sanding block as you start to develop the taper of the pencil. And then when you start to develop a point, start to push the pencil forward and backward instead of left and right, because then you give the tip of the pencil the support of all of the pencil behind it as you try to develop that point. Whereas if you're going left and right, that tip almost always snaps off. And so I see that people have a really hard time getting that super, super sharp tip with the white chalk pencil, which, as you can see here, we're definitely going to need. So it may be even more than just using a sanding block. You have to use the sanding block a pretty specific way of forward and backward. So again, I'm still not working with the model here, even though we have the picture-in-picture there. But you can start to see how some of my values are getting pretty light now when you squint down at the drawing and compare it to the reference. The values were actually pretty close before I started filling in the dots, because originally it was my intent to have just left it after that first or that second session of developing the torso out with the model. Instead of doing this refinement here. I am still also, it's a good point to mention, stepping back. Even though it's just regular old filling in of dots, every couple minutes or so I'll get back 3-4 feet to just make sure I didn't miss any dots that you might pass over up close.
It's interesting that drawings that have kind of like looser marks, even in the long sitting portrait of Dakota, there was definitely some looser marks in her face.
Mm-hmm.
And when you step back from it, I mean, it looks completely smooth.
Absolutely, yeah.
And here you are filling in these dots and making things as smooth as possible, and you're stepping back, and those little spots that you missed are glaring.
Right,
It's an interesting
Yeah.
thing what our brains and our eyes do.
Absolutely, yeah. There's certain abstract information we can accept, and certain stuff that we can't. And one of the reasons why the Dakota marks were a little more successful was because they were kind of on a foundation that was a little smoother already.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas this one, we're kind of fighting with the initial toning and texture of the paper, so it's looking a little backwards. But what we're going to see next, the finish of this, will have some abstract marks. And what we'll also see too is once I do start to develop that final coat, that final stage on the torso, is that I'm going to have to step back quite a bit because, as you can start to see here, some of the value changes now are just so subtle that it's going to be really difficult up close. I mean, we'll see some zoomed in versions, I think, coming up here. Up close, it's not really going to look like much of value difference from one area to the next. It's only when you step back that your eye really begins to pick out some of those value splotches. And part of the reason is because now the overall development of the drawing has such a sensitive balance of values that the brain is able to pick those areas out really quickly, whereas if we kept broad relationships, we wouldn't.